Hi, it's Katrina. My friend David is actually going to be helping me out today, so we can give you a little bit more variety. Everyone say hi!
Number 10. Sony Bean. Sony Bean is the most famous cannibal in Scottish history. We don't know much about his early life, but experts believe he was born in East Lothian in the late 15th century. He relocated to Ayrshire, married a woman, and set up his home inside of the Benane Cave. To support his new wife and growing family, he took to a life of robbery. He ambushed travelers on narrow roadways, stole their belongings, and murdered them so that he couldn't be identified. But somewhere along the way, Sony Bean truly lost his mind. Not only was he killing his victims, but he was also bringing them back to his cave and eating them. He was sustaining himself, his wife, and their family on a rich diet of human flesh. It's been reported that Sony Bean had at least 14 babies with his wife, and he fed each of them human meat. Then, as the years went on, Sony continued to breed and have more babies with his own children, raising new generations of cave-dwelling cannibals. For over 20 years, Sony Bean and his inbred family killed and ate humans. Local authorities were slow to act, but did eventually get suspicious when they started finding decayed human body parts showing up on all the beaches. The cannibal became such a big problem that King James I came to town with an army of 400 men and tracked down their hideout. The entire family, all 48 of them, were arrested, and the men were sentenced to death. Number 9. The Axeman of New Orleans. For 18 months in 1918, the city of New Orleans was plagued by a horrible serial killer who would come to be known only as the Axeman. He was responsible for 12 attacks that resulted in 6 deaths. In terrifying fashion, the Axeman specifically attacked people who were sleeping in their beds. He would break into a house, find himself a weapon, usually an axe, and then murder the homeowners as they slept. These poor people would wake up being bludgeoned by a psychopath. He would then leave his weapon at the scene of the crime and vanish into the night. The first attack occurred on May 23, 1918. The Axeman broke into a house at 4901 Magnolia Street and attacked Catherine and Joseph Maggio using an axe and a straight razor. Nothing was stolen. The murderer likely didn't know his victims. It was an act of indiscriminate brutality. After months and months of carnage, the Times-Picayune newspaper received a letter from the alleged killer. The Axeman claimed to be a demon, an evil spirit risen from hell. He also threatened the police, saying they were too stupid to catch him because he was protected by Satan himself. Unfortunately for New Orleans, the police did indeed fail to capture him or even identify him. The final attack occurred on October 27, 1919. Mike Peppertone was struck in the head by an axe in his own home, right in front of his wife. His wife woke up just in time to see the killer fleeing the scene and her husband dead on the ground. After that, the Axeman retired. Number 8. Kate Webster. Kate Webster was an Irish maid in Victorian London. She carried out one of the most savage murders of the 19th century when she dismembered her employer, a woman named Julia Martha Thomas. But let's start at the beginning. Kate Webster was born in County Wexford in 1849. She took to a life of thievery as a youngster, was imprisoned at the age of 15, and moved to Liverpool in 1867. She continued her criminal career there, was given 4 years for larceny in 1868, and was released in 1872. She then moved on to London, where she got a job as a maid. Her main objective was to rob her employers blind and then flee to a new job. She was caught doing this and went to jail again in 1875 and 1877. In 1879, Kate Webster was employed as a domestic servant to Julia Thomas in Richmond. She proved to be a really poor domestic servant, so she was fired. Kate was so angry that she never got to steal anything before getting fired that she threw her employer down the stairs, sawed her head off with a razor, sliced the rest of her body into pieces, burned whatever she could, and threw the rest into the river. But the real horror is that, according to Detective Inspector David Bolton, who recently re-examined the case in the 21st century, Kate Webster cooked a few pieces of her former employer. She then fed them to a couple of street boys because she thought it was funny. On July 29, 1879, Kate Webster was hanged. She was the only woman hanged at the Wandsworth prison out of 135 other criminals sentenced to death. Number 7. The Thames Torso Murders. The Thames Torso murders took place between 1887 and 1889. None of the murders were solved, and only 4 victims were ever identified. The only reason the authorities knew they were dealing with a serial killer was because the body parts had all been surgically operated on. A woman's skull was discovered alongside the river, then a woman's arm in a parcel. A human torso was found later, as well as other pieces of the victims. Somebody had surgically cut 2 victims into pieces, expertly separating the limbs from the torsos. No one ever found out who did it, and 3 years later the same thing happened again. Workers along the river found a bundle with the torso of a female in it, and then through that spring, more body parts washed up along the river. Each body part had been surgically removed, just like the victims 3 years prior. The murderer had struck again. Finally, the dismembered remains of yet another woman were found at 3 different sites across the city between September and October of 1888. Yet again, the limbs had all been removed from the torso with surgical precision. There were 4 bodies in total, and nobody has any clue who was responsible. Do you think it could have been a local doctor responsible for the murders? Tell us what you think in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. Number 6. Red Barn Murder. Maria Martin was born in the village of Polstead in 1801. She was an attractive young woman who found herself being courted by many of the town's young men. In May of 1827, she was persuaded to meet a man named William Corder at the Red Barn, a local landmark in the small English town. They were supposed to run away to Ipswich, where they would elope and live happily ever after. They did indeed meet at the Red Barn, but they never married, and Maria was never seen alive again. Following the arranged meeting in 1827, both Maria and William were gone. However, William remained in touch with Maria's family. He sent letters frequently, explaining that they were both in good health and that they were living joyfully on the Isle of Wight. A year later, something paranormal happened. Maria's stepmother began having dreams that Maria had been murdered. These dreams were persistent and convincing enough that she persuaded Maria's father to start poking around. Either by coincidence or divine intervention, Maria's father investigated the Red Barn and found Maria's skeletal remains hiding inside of a grain storage bin. She had been strangled and shot in the head, as well as stabbed multiple times with a sword. William was tracked down shockingly quickly for the early 19th century. He was arrested where he had taken up residence at a private school for girls in London. When he was finally brought to court, the jury took less than 30 minutes to find him guilty. The judge sentenced him to be hanged within the week. Number 5. The Pimlico Poisoning. On January 1st, 1886, Adelaide Bartlett woke up to find her husband Thomas lying dead on the floor. Thomas had been sick for quite some time, first falling ill in December of 1885, about a month earlier. The local doctor had come to their home in Pimlico, London, but there was nothing he could do to help the exhausted Mr. Bartlett. His illness was blamed on a mishap at the dentist 10 years earlier. His teeth had rotted and looked to be slowly poisoning him. At first, his death was attributed to an infection caused by his rotting teeth. But when an autopsy was performed, things got a little mysterious. Doctors discovered a lethal dose of chloroform inside his stomach. Somebody had poisoned Thomas, but no one could figure out how. The issue with chloroform is that it's a caustic substance and will burn tissue it comes into contact with. Because Thomas had no chemical burns in his throat, doctors couldn't figure out how the poison had made its way into his stomach. It was revealed that Thomas's wife and the local minister, George Dyson, had secretly been working together. Adelaide and Thomas were in a loveless marriage, and Thomas had promised the minister that if he were to die, he could have his wife. When the case went to trial, nobody was found guilty of murder. George and Adelaide were both acquitted, mostly because nobody could figure out how either of them had poisoned Thomas. It was clear this was some kind of strange love triangle situation, but the court couldn't prove it beyond a doubt. To this day, we still don't know who poisoned Thomas, or how they got the poison into his system. Number 4. The Mayflower Killer. The Plymouth colony had been in America for about 10 years when disaster struck. These pilgrims had traveled across the Atlantic Ocean on the Mayflower in September of 1620 and were some of the very first people from Europe to build a life for themselves in the New World. But even in the New World, they found themselves dealing with a murderer. John Billington was one of the first 41 pilgrims, but he didn't make history for what he did as a settler, but rather for what he did in 1630 when he shot and killed another colonist. John was a problem from the very beginning. He was like the bad kid in class. He was the first person to commit a crime in America in 1621 when he refused to obey the orders of the military. He kept getting into disputes, he was trying to undermine the colony, and he was just generally troublesome. Then in 1630, he shot and killed John Newcomen. The two had been arguing for quite some time, and their differences erupted in violence. John Billington became the first to murder another settler in Plymouth Colony, and he was subsequently found guilty of murder and hanged. Number 3. The Villisca Axe Murders. 110 years since the brutal Villisca Axe Murders, the crime still goes unsolved. It happened on June 10, 1912. The bodies of Josiah and Sarah Moore, their 4 kids, and 2 visiting local girls who had been hanging out with their children were all found dead in their beds in the town of Villisca, just 100 miles from Des Moines in Iowa. The children were Herman Moore, 11 years old, Catherine Moore, 10 years old, Boyd Moore, 7, Paul Moore, 5, then Lena Stillinger, and Ina Stillinger, 12 and 8. Each one had been killed with an axe that was taken from the family's backyard. It happened while they were sleeping at around midnight. Before the killings, the family had spent the night at the local church and got home a little late at around 10 o'clock. Just 2 hours later, they were all dead. The murder is particularly bizarre because no one heard any cries coming from the house. The neighbors didn't detect a raucous, and none of the victims appeared to hear anyone else in the house being killed. You would imagine that at some point in the massacre, someone would have woken up and ran, but each one of them were killed in bed, totally oblivious to what was happening. Approximately 110 years later, Iowa's most chilling murder is still unsolved. Number 2. Medieval Killers. While a group of restorers were doing some work inside the Cathedral of the Transfiguration of the Savior in Russia, they came across a mysterious inscription on one of the walls. The inscription contained a list of 20 medieval murderers. It may just be helping to shed some new light on one of the greatest murder mysteries of Russia in the 12th century. The inscription mentions Andrei Bogolyubsky, the Grand Prince of Vladimir Suzdal in 1174 AD. He was one of the most powerful princes of Europe, and he was murdered. The inscription says that the prince was killed by his servants, while the list of murderers mentions each person who was involved by name. 3 of the individuals on the list were already known by historians for being involved in the legendary assassination, but the other names were previously unknown. Andrei Bogolyubsky ruled over a major principality in Rus and was primarily responsible for the decline of Kiev's grip over the northern lands. As he reduced the power of the upper nobility, they began to plot against him. On the night of June 28, 1174, 20 men burst into his bedchamber and stabbed him to death. One of the killers was his wife's brother, Yakim Kichka. And while historians already knew his name, as well as the names of Petr Fralovich and Ambal, nobody ever knew the identities of the other 17 killers until now. Number 1. Edgar Allan Poe and Mary Rogers. Mary Rogers turned up dead in the Hudson River in 1838. Mary was a teenager, the beautiful daughter of a boarding house keeper who worked as a clerk at John Anderson's Liberty Street cigar shop. She sold tobacco to some of the most prominent writers of the day, men like James Fenimore Cooper and Washington Irving. On July 25th, Mary went out and never returned home. It was stormy out, and so her mother assumed she had gotten held up by bad weather. But by the next night, when Mary still hadn't returned, people began to worry, and on July 28th, her corpse was found floating in the river. The coroner did an autopsy and determined Mary had been beaten to death. The main suspect was her fiancé, Daniel Payne. There were allegations that Mary had been thinking about breaking off the marriage and that Daniel had killed her in a fit of rage. But Daniel had an airtight alibi, so it couldn't have been him. Some believed Mary had been killed by criminals, a robbery gone wrong. Then it came out that she'd been seen in the company of a tall, dark stranger on the evening she went missing, but nobody could ever figure out the identity of this mysterious stranger. Even Edgar Allan Poe in 1842 tried to solve the case, but came up empty, instead resorting to memorializing Mary's mysterious death in the mystery of Marie Roget. Which of these true crime tales disturbed you the most? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching. Remember to hit subscribe if you haven't yet, and come back soon for more unbelievable videos.